Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday the 26th of May. I'm Andrew Wilson and this is Scotland at 7. This evening I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 92 of the illegal Russian invasion. Then I'll introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Ukraine's president and foreign minister have pleaded with the West to send more weapons to their military in the face of Russia's intensifying assault on the eastern Donbass region. We need the help of our partners, above all weapons for Ukraine. Full help, without exceptions, without limits, enough to win, Volodymyr Zelensky said in his nightly address on Wednesday. Earlier in the day, Dmitry Kuleba told the World Economic Forum in Davos that NATO was doing virtually nothing to help Ukraine. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Andrei Rudenko, said Moscow is ready to provide a humanitarian corridor for vessels carrying food to leave Ukraine, in return for the lifting of some sanctions. Zelensky has rejected the notion that his country should cede territory to make peace with Russia. Symptomatic editorials began to appear in some Western media, stating that Ukraine must allegedly accept so-called difficult compromises by giving up territory in exchange for peace, he said in his latest nightly address. Those who advise Ukraine to give up territory fail to see the ordinary people, he said, who actually live in the territory they propose to exchange for the illusion of peace. There are about 8,000 Ukrainian prisoners of war held in the Russian-backed self-proclaimed Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics. The Luhansk official Rodion Miroshnik was quoted by the TASS news agency as saying, "The Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian-appointed Crimean government, Georgy Muradov, has said the Sea of Azov is lost forever to Ukraine. He is reported to have said, ports in Zaporizhia and Kherson regions will never again be Ukrainian. I am sure that after the reunification of our regions with Russia, the Sea of Azov will again, as it was before, become exclusively an inland sea of the Russian Federation." Russia's Ministry of Defense claims that as a result of their operations in the last 24 hours, more than 350 Ukrainian fighters were killed, and 96 units of weapons and military equipment were disabled. Russian forces shelled more than 40 other towns in the Donbass on Wednesday, Ukraine's military has said, threatening to shut off the last main escape route for civilians trapped in the path of their invasion. Ukraine's governor of Kharkiv, Ole Syniehubov, has said fighting is most intense in the Izium region. He claimed the Russians are trying to improve the tactical situation in the area of the city of Izium and resume the offensive on Slovyansk. Maxim Kozytsky, the governor of Lviv, has said that for the first time since Lviv started accepting displaced people from elsewhere in Ukraine, there was not a single person who registered for temporary accommodation yesterday. And 2 alleged Wagner Group fighters from Belarus have been accused of murdering civilians near Kyiv, making them the first international mercenaries to face war crimes charges in Ukraine. Ukrainian prosecutors have released the names and photographs of 8 men wanted for alleged war crimes, including murder and torture, in the village of Motshin. Several have believed to have fought previously in Syria. Now, we're lucky enough to be joined this evening by Richard Thomson MP. Richard is the Scottish National Party MP for Gordon, has been an MP and has been the MP since December 2019. He currently undertakes the roles of Shadow SNP Deputy Spokesperson, Treasury Financial Secretary, the Shadow SNP Spokesperson Northern Ireland, and the Shadow SNP Spokesperson for Wales. In 2015, he became the leader of the SNP group of councillors in Aberdeenshire, serving as co-leader of that council until 2017, and as leader of the opposition until he stepped down as a councillor following his election to Westminster. So Richard already knows a thing or three about how councils work. Richard, good evening. How are you keeping?
Good evening, Andrew. I'm keeping very well, thanks.
Well, I'm delighted to hear it, and thank you for joining us this evening on Broadcasting Scotland. Officials in Ukraine have admitted that Russia has the upper hand in fighting in the country's east, as Ukrainian forces fell back from some of their positions in the Donbass. Amid reports that Lyman, the site of an important railway junction, had largely been taken by Russian forces, Ukraine's general staff reported that Russian forces were also advancing on Severodonetsk, Bakhmut, and Advika. The governor of Luhansk region, Serhiy Haidai, said just 5% of the region now remained in Ukrainian hands, down from something like 10% little more than a week ago, and that Ukrainian forces were retreating in some areas. Separately, a senior Ukrainian military official conceded at a briefing on Thursday that Russia had the upper hand in fighting in Luhansk. Russia has the advantage, but we are doing everything we can, General Alexei Gromov said. Haidai said that police in Lysychansk were burying the bodies of civilians in mass graves, with about 150 people having been buried in such a grave in only one district. If confirmed, Russia's continuing advances in Lyman, which has been contested for a month, would make it easier for Russian forces to isolate the key city of Severodonetsk, which has been under relentless shelling for days. According to accounts posted on social media, Lyman's Ukrainian defenders had pulled back to the southern outskirts, although fighting was continuing, in particular around the railway sidings in the city. Outside Severodonetsk, now the focal point of Moscow's renewed offensive in Donbass, Haidai said that fighting was very difficult. Predicting the coming week will be decisive, Haidai said that the city was being subjected to a colossal amount of shelling by Russian troops, attempting to batter it into submission. After failing to seize Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, or its second city, Kharkiv, in its 3-month war, Russia is trying to take full control of Donbass, comprising 2 eastern provinces that Russia claims. Moscow has poured thousands of troops into the region, attacking from 3 sides in an attempt to encircle Ukrainian forces holding out in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Their fall would leave the whole of Luhansk province under Russian control, a main aim of Kremlin's war. So, Richard, first of all, thank you for bearing with me with that detailed report from the front in eastern Ukraine. Thinking for a moment about a wider issue here, with such heavy and sustained bombardment, what's going to be left standing in Donbass? Is Donbass going to be reduced to the barren level of the parts of Russia that's been providing conscripts who are astonished to see roads made of tarmac and dishwashers, and who, of course, stole £2.5 million of new John Deere tractors? Or is the Donbass going to end up the smoking rubble of the one-time city of Aleppo, levelled by Putin and Assad?
I honestly don't know the answer to that, Andrew, but you would think that if you were a rational actor, and I'm not certain how rational we can any longer say that Vladimir Putin is, that if you're looking to take control of territory, you want something there to be worth controlling when you're done. And this, what we're seeing, is a thoroughly scorched earth policy, because for all of their weights of numbers, the Russian military don't appear to be particularly skilled. They don't appear to be able to mount particularly complex operations. They have been thoroughly outfought and outgunned by the Ukrainian forces with the help they've been getting from Western allies. So I don't think that they've got anything more sophisticated in their locker other than this relentless bombardment. And I think what we're going to see is a prolonged war of attrition here. The Ukrainians fought valiantly to keep the Russians out of Kiev and other cities, but the Russians had really overreached themselves trying to fight on a number of fronts, and their logistics just weren't up to the task. And I don't know if any our viewers on Broadcasting Scotland follow him, but Dr. Philip O'Brien of St Andrews University has some excellent threads each day on how the conflict is going, and in particular being able to analyse strategically just what is going on based on the information that comes back from the front line. Now, my gut feeling, I'm not a military strategist, but my gut feeling is that by concentrating on one smaller area like the Donbass, which borders Russia, that should make their logistical lines of supply a lot easier, and they may just begin to get the upper hand, the Russians, with the weight of numbers rolling over the top of the Ukrainians, no matter how much better armed and no matter how more effective the Ukrainians are individually and collectively as a fighting force. So I think that is the danger. So we're moving into a different phase of the war, I think. And I think the challenge now is for the Western allies who have been supplying the Ukrainians with armaments, is to make sure that the type of armaments they are continuing, that they are now supplying, are appropriate for the phase. And that might mean longer range artillery to wipe out the artillery that the Russians are using to level these Ukrainian settlements. Because I think one of the great successes that the Ukrainians has was as soon as they were able to push back Russian forces from the outskirts of the cities were largely able to be protected, and it was only missiles, and I use the word only very lightly there, but the sort of prolonged shelling from artillery was no longer possible. And I think that is where the Ukrainians probably need to be, and what the sort of equipment we need to be supplying to them now. But I think that in terms of pushing back the Russians, that's always going to be a difficult task. How well can the Russians hold on to what they have with a population that's largely hostile? That remains to be seen, but I don't think we're going to see the rapid advance and retreat in this next phase of the war that we saw in the initial few weeks of the conflict.
Thank you, Richard. I'm sure that we'll come back to both the military tactics and the impact that the war is having on people. I'm sure that you and I will discuss it on more than one occasion in the future. So, because of the news in the UK today, we'll move on from Ukraine at the moment. And if you'll indulge me, I'll spend a little bit of time introducing today's cost of living package announced by the Westminster Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. But I'll introduce it in a little bit of detail. But I promise that you and I will have a sensible amount of time, maybe 20 minutes, to examine it in some detail and look at the various elements and aspects to it. And that's because in a statement to the Westminster Parliament today, the UK Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, announced a raft of measures which he said would provide the most vulnerable households with over £1,000 to help with the cost of living crisis. The measures announced include the most vulnerable households across Scotland will receive support of over £1,000 this year, including a new one-off £650 cost of living payment. Universal support increases to £400 across Great Britain as the October discount on energy bills is doubled, and the requirement to repay the discount over 5 years is scrapped. A new £15 billion support package targeted towards low-income households and brings the total cost of living support from Westminster to £37 billion. New temporary energy profits levy on oil and gas firms to raise around £5 billion over the next year to help with the cost of living, with a new investment allowance to encourage firms to invest in oil and gas extraction in the UK continental shelf. Additionally, there will be Barnett consequentials as a result of an increase of £500 million to the Household Support Fund that is administered by councils in England. In Scotland, the Finance Secretary Kate Forbes has welcomed the short-term action announced by the Chancellor, but has warned that more support is needed for households and businesses as the cost of living crisis worsens. Responding to the Chancellor's statement, Ms Forbes has said that UK ministers should have acted earlier and gone further to provide more support that would make a real long-term impact, including following the Scottish Government's lead by doubling the Scottish Child Payment to £20 per week, which is due to increase again to £25 from late 2022, and thereby helping to lift an estimated 20,000 children out of poverty in 2023. The SNP's Shadow Work and Pension spokesperson at Westminster, Kirsty Blackman MP, also said, while some of the measures announced by the Chancellor, including his U-turn on the SNP's repeated calls to turn his energy loan into a more generous grant, are more welcome, it's clear they still fall desperately short of what is needed at this critical time. The Chancellor is sitting on an estimated £30 billion of fiscal headroom, but has only chosen to spend around £15 billion. While people are sitting in cold houses and turning to food banks, Rishi Sunak is sitting on a £15 billion £15 billion election war chest. The Scottish Greens said that Mr Sunak's package will be devastating for climate. Ross Greer MSP commented, "In an environmentally devastating SOP to oil and gas corporations, the Chancellor has given them the opportunity to avoid his windfall tax if they increase the extraction of fossil fuels from UK fields." So, Richard, thank you for bearing with me as I introduced that broad set of information following on from Rishi Sunak's statement to the House of Commons this morning. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, one thing struck me. In connection with his statement today, there are no Office for Budget Responsibility figures. So there's no vaguely independent assessment of what this all means, even though this is, to me, clearly a major fiscal event, just like a budget. So is one of the problems here with this Tory government, it just always avoids scrutiny, or at least until Sue Gray turns up?
Well, yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, I wasn't in the chamber today. I had other things that I needed to do elsewhere in Westminster. But, it's been known for quite a few weeks now that the Conservatives were considering levying a windfall tax on the oil and gas sector. Let's not make any bones about it. That's exactly what it is, a windfall tax. And the fact that they've done it without without bringing forward any figures from the OBR, I think shows the nature of some of the arm wrestling that's been going on behind the scenes. And, a bit like on the Mrs. Merton show when she asked Debbie McGee what was it that first attracted you to multi-millionaire magician Paul Daniels. The question has been asked of Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. What was it about the Sue Gray report that first attracted you to a levy and a windfall tax to distract everybody from this? So it's clear the Tories have been speaking out against this for a while. I was sceptical about a windfall tax, and I think they can be a blunt instrument. But when Labour first announced this, I was against it. But I think there's a couple of things that have changed since then. First of all, there's been the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has sent profits of some energy companies sky high and bringing in revenues that go way beyond what their investment plans are and what they need to rebuild their balance sheets. But also the continuing cost of living crisis that has taken hold, particularly since then. So I think that a levy on excess profits is a reasonable thing to do. But I wouldn't have stopped at energy companies, because there are plenty of other companies that have profited very significantly from the current constraints in supply due to the pandemic and the invasion. And Google, Amazon, Apple, to name but three. And there's other parts of the energy sector as well. Some, depending on what contracts they're on, there are some renewables generators who are not paid a spot price as such, or a fixed price rather than a spot price, but which are benefiting enormously from electricity prices being at the level that there are. So I think there's a reasonable argument for the UK government to be levying a tax, but they shouldn't be confining it to oil and gas, because there are other sectors that have profited considerably from the current adverse circumstances. And I think using those proceeds to help families at this very difficult time is the right thing to do. I mean, when Rishi Sunak had his spring statement, the reaction to it was that it? I think the reaction to this one will be, well, okay, that's something and it will take the edge off it, but you could be doing a lot more, because as you've pointed out, Andrew, it's a measure which is about £15 billion. That in itself is significant. But he had a fiscal headroom available of up to £30 billion. Now, he might just be keeping something in the tank for later in the year. But I think what this shows at is that the Chancellor has something of a tin ear politically. He might want to portray this as listening and reacting to circumstances, but there is nothing that is known now, really, that was not known at the time of his spring statement. So bringing in some of these extra allowances, bringing in some of these extra payments, it's all well and good. but a chancellor that really understood how life was lived by the majority of people, particularly those who know what it's like to struggle to pay a bill because they're doing it every day in life practically. I think it just goes to show how out of touch he really is. And while the situation is better today than it was yesterday, he could still have gone further and may need to go further. But also, I think that Kate Forbes, the Scottish Finance Secretary, sent him a very good letter earlier today or yesterday, setting out some of the asks, so which and the measures that have come forward have fallen short of those asks. And again, I've seen nothing to address the point that Kate also made towards the end of her letter, that because of inflationary pressures, the Scottish budget has effectively, in real terms, been cut by about 5%. Now, that makes it much, much more difficult for the Scottish Government to do things to keep the economy moving, to fund our public services in the manner that we would hope they would be funded. So, Rishi Sunak has only 15 billion is maybe harsh to describe that as a half measure, but it could and should have gone further. But of course, we've been saying that for a number of months now, and this does at least repair some of the damage from the inaction of the spring statement. But he needs to be making sure this is getting to those who need it most, but they're going to need more. And also, we need to be making sure that we really are stepping up that investment in our renewables sector and our transition, because it's only by locking in those renewables that we tackle the twin crisis of the cost of living crisis, by nailing down energy prices, and also the climate crisis, which we know hasn't gone away, whatever the cost of living crisis is doing to divert our attentions presently.
Thanks, Richard. That was a great starter across a number of questions I was going to ask you. So we'll take through the points that you've made one at a time, because I think each of them are very important and bear a little bit more examination. You mentioned, first of all, the £30 billion of fiscal headroom that Rishi Sunak currently has, and that spending half of that during a cost of living crisis doesn't really go far enough, especially when there's another £5 billion being added to the fiscal headroom by the windfall tax, or what Rishi calls the levy. So why do you think he's not spending more? Is it his tenure? Is he stoking up an election war chest because he can see catastrophe coming for the Conservative government with it earlier than expected? Or does he expect things to get much worse, so he'll need more cash then? Or is he worried about the ongoing impact of Brexit crashing the UK economy and making things even worse?
I think it's just a question of trying to move from day to day. He luckily, at the start of the pandemic, there was somebody in the Treasury who remembered a little bit about Keynesian economics and was able to persuade the Chancellor that maintaining demand in the economy was the most important thing at that point to keep everything ticking over. Because obviously your GDP is your government expenditure plus your investment, plus your exports minus your imports, and the government spending is a key part of that equation. So luckily that there was that there, but I think he wants to portray himself as some kind of fiscal conservative because he judges that that's where the votes are for any future leadership campaigns. Although the star has waned considerably since the spring statement. I'm not sure that the sort of money that they need to spend in terms of trying to recapture popularity is, I'm not sure £15 billion is enough. I think if the Conservatives want to just let rip with the public finances ahead of an election, they'll do that, and they'll say it's because of prudent management of the economy, and there'll be enough people who are daft enough to believe that. And if they need to find money to try and buy the re-election, they will find it one way or another. It's not going to be found down the back of the sofa. But nevertheless, that £15 billion spent okay in as far as it goes, but there was that £30 billion headroom that was mentioned before, because that was made up of £15 billion of additional taxation, plus £15 billion of borrowing that wasn't required. So Yeah, but I think he needs to be mindful of all parts of the economy because, as I said, your GDP, it's the sum of your consumption and your investment plus the government spending. A lot of Conservatives don't like to factor in that government spending part, and then you've got your exports minus your imports. So keeping that aggregate demand up is hugely important. Government spending is one of the ways of doing that. Encouraging investments another way of that, and keeping up the consumption because particularly putting money into the pockets of lower earners because they're the ones that are really feeling the squeeze right now. And when people on lower incomes have more money in their pocket, of course they're going to spend it. That's exactly what you want them to do, but they're tending not to spend it on the frivolities that people who are perhaps better off are doing. They may save some, but in all likelihood, the money is going to go out on the life's essentials, which keeps everything else ticking over. So I think that the priority at the moment is to make sure that we're keeping the consumption going as well and making sure that people are not spending disproportionate amounts of their family budgets or their individual budgets on simply paying fuel bills and adding to the cost of energy companies in that way.
Completely, Richard. Now you've nicely teed up the next question that I had for you, and you mentioned there the transformation in Westminster Number 11 thinking from the austerity years under George Osborne, where the economy was deliberately shrunk and we all suffered from austerity for 12 years. Rishi Sunak's statement today was also worryingly silent on public sector pay, with no related consequential funding. But as you were saying, the lowest paid need urgent assurance in the face of rising inflation, and the lowest paid are an important part of our economy, and public sector pay is an important part of GDP. Now, from a different perspective, Sue Gray has already made it very plain this week. If ever there was any doubt what Downing Street and those who work there think of low-paid workers, and we've seen apologies from we've been told that there have been apologies from the Prime Minister to the lowest paid workers in Downing Street over the last 48 hours. So do you think that in the context of those two facts, do you think we're going to see the Westminster government begin to address the challenges of the very low public sector pay that we already have, and how those on the lowest pay, their income is going to be hammered the worst by, as you say, inflation that's running at 9% just now, and is thought by academics and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to be nearer 13% for those on the lowest incomes?
Well, in short, no, I don't think they are. I mean, I would say at this point, having been a low-paid worker in the private sector beforehand, don't forget the low-paid in the private sector as well. But I think there's going to be a temptation, whether it's in the public sector or in the private sector, to try and keep costs down. And when most organisations have approximately 50% of their outgoings as wages, it's inevitable, sadly, that there's always going to be a focus on wage bills, minimising wage increases, or looking at headcount. And in the public sector, that can be a false economy because you need to, particularly to be, you need to be clear about what it is you're expecting people to do, because you can't simultaneously heap on additional responsibilities as we have through the pandemic and Brexit, and then not expect to have to pay for that or be able to do it with reduced headcounts, which is why the UK government announcing potentially 90,000 reduction in the headcount in the civil service seems to me to be so short-sighted, because it seemed to have plucked a number out of thin air. It's a bit like when the Tories are boasting about they're recruiting 20,000 police officers across England. You think, well, whoop-de-doo, if you hadn't reduced the number of police officers in England by 20,000 since the year 2010, maybe you wouldn't need to be running around to recruit them again. So there are false economies in things like that. But fundamentally, one of the biggest challenges that we have in Scotland as well is about productivity. Now, our productivity levels are pretty low in comparison, or not pretty low, but they're not as good as many of our European competitors. Now, you can come up with a number of reasons for that. As a Scottish nationalist, you would expect me to say that a government that had greater control over the fiscal levers would be able to use those levers more judiciously, a welfare system that's better integrated with keeping people keeping people well funded, giving them enough to be able to live the kinds of lives that they need to, and helping people, those who are able and willing to get back into work. Things like having, the 1,140 hours of free childcare every year. All of these things are going to unleash talents in the workforce and help to build up our productivity. But we particularly lag behind our European competitors in things like research and development funding, as a proportion of GDP that we spend. So fundamentally, nobody owes us a living. But if we want to be a more prosperous country, if we want to earn our social democracy, then one of the key things that we need to do is look at how we can make ourselves more productive. And that will come down to adaptations in technology. It comes down to having the most diverse, talented workforce that you can possibly have. It means embracing the possibilities of working at home and, for some workers, compressed weeks and job sharing, and simply allowing everybody who has talents to bring to the workforce to be able to bring it. Because that fundamentally is the way that we're going to get the lifestyles that we want and the productivity that allows us to earn our social democracy and make sure that we've got the kind of safety nets that we would want there, and the kind of ability to help create the society that we want, which allows people to have that kind of equality of opportunity that I think any decent social democrat would want to see.
Completely, Richard. Thank you. And whilst we've had a good conversation, there's one little point I was going to make with you. I want to discuss with you quickly. And I think we have a little bit of time. In addition to the statement from the Treasury that followed up from Rishi Sunak's statement to the House this morning, we were lucky enough to also receive an extra special Fan Dabby Dozy tartan version with added reflections on poverty and the cost of living from the multimillionaire farmer and offshore investor Alistair Jack MP. Now, there's two things that jumped out to me from his press release. Firstly, he said that the significant intervention includes a new one-off £650 payment to more than 8 million low-income households on universal credit. Of course, the statement is very silent on the fact that less than a year ago they took away the universal credit uplift, which was £1,040 a year, when we were told that the pandemic was over. So in the similar ways you were saying, Tory accounting on the number of police officers in England and Wales, we're being told that those on universal credit are being given £650 less than a year after £1,000 was taken off them. But having made that point, it also struck me even more strongly that, at a point that you were making, in this statement, Alistair Jack is quoted as saying, "Global issues are causing real pressures on the cost of living for UK families. We understand how tough it is at the moment for many UK households." Now, the Daily Express estimates Alistair Jack's personal wealth at £20 million, and they rank him in the top 10 wealthiest Tory government ministers. At the very least, he's paid £90,000 a year as Secretary of State for Scotland. And so the question, to follow on from something that you said, was you see both these politicians operating in the House of Commons. So is the millionaire Alistair Jack more out of touch or less out of touch than the millionaire Chancellor and his billionaire wife?
I really wouldn't know where to start with that, Andrew. But I have to say that Rishi Sunak does have something about him. Even if it's just a talent for self-publicity. Alistair Jack, I'm really not sure what's there, to be perfectly honest. I think he's popular. I'm sure he's. The rumour is that he invites people to go hunting, shooting, fishing with him in his constituency on the land that he owns. I've never been overawed by any conspicuous political ability or talent. In fact, they usually let the junior ministers speak on his behalf whenever there's something happening at the Scotland office at Dover House. But I think those sorts of statements just. I think it just goes to show that when it comes to how life is lived for most people, including his constituents, Alistair doesn't know Jack.
Spot on, Richard. Thank you. Now, that's enough discussion of the cost of living statement from Rishi Sunak today. We'll move on to Scottish politics, if that's okay. Because Anas Sarwar is being urged to stop insulting voters' intelligence in Scotland over Labour's deals with the Tories in councils across the country. It comes after his party has done an array of alleged deals, including relying on Tory support to get into power, giving senior positions within councils to the Tories, or abstaining to allow Tories to take control of council administrations. Alleged deals are said to have been done in Edinburgh, West Lothian, East Renfrewshire, South Lanarkshire, Fife, South Ayrshire, and Murray. Nearly two-thirds of all Labour council administrations have been created because of deals with the Tories. The SNP is calling on Anas Sarwar to stop insulting voters and admit he has broken his pre-election promise to not do deals with any party. The SNP MSP Rona Mackay said, in council areas across Scotland, Labour have entered into grubby backroom deals with the Tories. Anas Sarwar must stop insulting the intelligence of the people of Scotland. The least he can do is to be honest about these agreements. Sarwar needs to own up. He has broken a key election promise that his party would not enter into any deal with any party. But instead, Labour have been working hand in hand with the Tories and offering them powerful positions in Scotland's councils. So, Richard, backroom deals are no surprise in any sort of politics, local or national. But is it a surprise that these deals are happening, that are now reported to be happening, were specifically ruled out by Anas Sarwar?
No, I don't think it is a surprise because, I find Anas Sarwar, frankly, somebody who's not trustworthy at all. I find him exceptionally glib and somebody that, if he told me the sky was blue and they had a Y in it, I'd look out the window and then look at the calendar to check that those things were in fact the case. So, the whole point of politics is about power. It's about controlling the institutions in order to deliver the best outcomes you can for the people who you represent. And it's about resolving those conflicts over resources. So any politician that says they don't want to be in office or they don't want to influence is frankly at it, because quite clearly the only reason for being involved in politics is to have influence, whether that's directly or indirectly, over how we conduct our finances and our public affairs. So that's the fundamental point. So Anas Sarwar standing up and basically saying there will be no deals with the Tories or the SNP, he was basically saying that he didn't want Labour to be in power anywhere, and frankly, was just always a work of fiction. I think it really does show how dumb he thinks that the rest of us are, because even if his party isn't going directly into a formal coalition, even if there aren't formal coalitions there, if you're conducting deals with Conservatives or others to step aside to allow your councillors to form an administration, you've effectively got a coalition, or to all intents and purposes, a confidence and supply, and that is a deal. And frankly, it just insults the intelligence to try and pretend otherwise. Now, there's a list of local authorities that are where this has been going on. I think in Fife it's a Lib Lab Tory arrangement. Edinburgh today was announced as Lib Lab Tory as well. East Renfrewshire's done a Labour Tory deal. West Lothian's Labour Tory, Stirling's Labour Tory, Murray is exactly the same. South Lanarkshire, there's also a rainbow coalition of Lib Lab and Tory there, and it was really if it wasn't so infuriating, it would be amusing that Anas Sarwar was standing outside the headquarters of interviewed outside the headquarters of South Lanarkshire Council, denying point blank to a reporter, I think from a video journalist from the Scotsman newspaper, that any kind of deals were going on when they'd just concluded one in the building that he was standing being interviewed in front of. So it's utterly risible for Labour to claim that they don't want power or that they're not doing these deals. And as Nicola Sturgeon said, it would be better just owning it, because of course politicians want to be running administrations and local authorities. There's nothing at all that's disreputable about that whatsoever. There's also no rule written down that it always has to be the largest party that forms an administration. The SNP group in Aberdeenshire fell victim to that in 2012 when I was first elected as a councillor, when we had 28 councillors out of 68. They were miles ahead of everybody else, but there was a rainbow coalition put together to keep us out. And, all's fair in that sense. But so there's no rule that the largest party has to be the one that is in the administration. Of course, the SNP is the largest group in a great many of Scotland's councils. But frankly, it is an insult to the intelligence for Anas Sarwar to stand up and claim that his party is not doing deals with Conservatives, because the Dugs in the street can see for themselves that that is exactly what he is doing. And in his own way, he is debilitating and undermining and discrediting political discourse in exactly the same sort of way as Boris Johnson does every time he stands up and tells a lie. Because quite frankly, that's all Anas Sarwar is doing as well. And he should just own up to what he's doing. And, go back to the people, if it's more important to have coalitions to keep the SNP out, he should be honest and straightforward with the Scottish people that that is what he's doing and explain why he's doing it, instead of this pantomime that we're going through at the moment.
Absolutely, Richard. As you say, the Dugs in the street, probably the Dugs in the farmyards as well. I was minded that as the voters outside looked from pig to man and from man to pig and from pig to man again, that already it was impossible to say which was which. And I'll stop quoting Orwell one of these days. But let's move on. And let's look at a little bit of politics from Ireland, because the Stormont Assembly is to meet on Monday in a new attempt to nominate a speaker, after more than 30 members of the Legislative Assembly signed a recall petition. The Sinn Féin president, Michelle O'Neill, said it was important that the Assembly meets to get down to business and starts delivering for the public. But the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, described the recall motion from Sinn Féin as a stunt. The DUP has blocked the election of a speaker and the formation of an executive after the Northern Ireland Assembly elections, as part of its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. After a motion from Sinn Féin, the outgoing Speaker, Alex Maskey, said in a letter to MLAs that the purpose of Monday's recall was to elect a Speaker, Deputy Speakers, and to appoint a First Minister and Deputy First Minister. Geoffrey Donaldson said his party would continue to block the return of the devolved power-sharing institutions until it saw action by Westminster over the Northern Ireland Protocol. So, Richard, in general terms, and I appreciate you, the SNP spokesperson on Northern Ireland at the moment, are the events of the last 2 weeks since the election in Northern Ireland, are they evidence that in fact what we have is an imperfect but so far holding up peace in Northern Ireland? I'm thinking that Stormont hasn't sat for about a month of its existence, after all, and yet the institutions are still there. And maybe not functioning in the way that it was expected. So if this is evidence that the structures that we have are continuing to hold up, and most importantly, that relative peace is being maintained, are these events this week an indication that we should be more worried than usual?
No, I think we're at a bit of an impasse, and Northern Irish politics for the last few months has been in something I would describe it as a bit of a holding pattern. Clearly, the Northern Ireland Protocol has caused considerable difficulties for those of a unionist persuasion, also for those of a non-aligned and nationalist persuasion as well, because it is causing some disruption. Not as much as some would invite us to believe, perhaps, but nevertheless, there is a hugely symbolic aspect to people in Northern Ireland being told that effectively there is a trade border down the Irish Sea, which separates them from Great Britain. So the United Kingdom, as a result of the protocol, is not as much of a United Kingdom as it once was. Also, there's been a significant reorientation of trade from east-west, from Northern Ireland to Great Britain and vice versa, to a greater north-south, all-Ireland type economy, which is putting the fear into a lot of unionists as well, because they think that undermines Northern Ireland's place in the union. But there are difficulties associated with that, and as tempting as it is to keep going back with the same message to the Tory government in London, say, well, this was your deal, you said it was off and ready, you signed it, that only takes us so far. And I think that the difficulty is that there needs to be a protocol. It maybe didn't need to be a protocol on these terms, but there needs to be some kind of agreement. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a hard border that breaches international agreements that are there, the Good Friday Agreement, and is something that would just be utterly disastrous and undermine so much of the progress that's been made in Northern Ireland over the last 20 to 25 years. So, where we are, The UK government wants to reopen negotiations on the protocol. The European Union is saying, no, that is not possible. There has to be some movement somewhere. And I think the trouble is that because of its posturing, the UK government has sacrificed a great deal of the goodwill that might actually have persuaded our European partners to look again at some aspects of this. Now, that's not to say the European Union has been completely inflexible, because there's a deal that was signed off between the UK government and Michel Barnier was the chief negotiator. We've now got the Trade Commissioner Maros Sefcovic, who's leading with a negotiating mandate from the European Union. And I think it's fair to say the European Union has moved quite considerably on a number of the issues round about the protocol to come up with easements which would make cross-border trade a great deal easier. I mean, chief amongst that is the need to keep the sanitary and phytosanitary zones pure, because the UK government has refused to align with European sanitary and phytosanitary standards, or realign, or stay. Well, they'll keep aligned with them in future. Now, the suspicion is that they want that in order to be able to sign these super duper whizzy trade deals with the rest of the world and undermine, domestic food production standards in the process, so that their hands aren't tied. The difficulty is that while our standards are in alignment, as they are still, it's also stymieing things like the seed potato industry, which is of particular importance to Scotland. So the irony is that actually, if they can't have the purity of the union and the purity of a hard Brexit that they've got, and something needs to give. And they don't need to rejoin the single market or the customs union. But the closer the UK is willing to move in terms of realigning with the single market and the customs union, the less onerous and obtrusive these trade border checks become. Perhaps there is a landing zone there in terms of, because one of the other issues is that Northern Ireland will still be subject to EU law in many respects, but not have a say over how that is done. Now, of course, that's the peril of being in the European Economic Area, for example, like Norway, but not in the European Union. But fundamentally, I think if there is a landing zone to this, it's that the closer you bring it's not about changing anything in Northern Ireland necessarily. It's about changing what Brexit means for Great Britain, because the closer we come back into alignment with the single market and the customs union, the less problematic many of the things that are being complained about in the protocol actually become. And I'm sure that you can fudge things about the jurisdiction of the Court of Human Rights, which nobody's really talking about apart from the constitutional obsessives, really. You can find some kind of joint administrative body that would do that. But of course, the thing in this for Scotland is, and whether Scotland is in the Union, as we are just now, or out of the Union, as I very much hope we soon are, the fewer borders in terms of trade that there are between Scotland and Northern Ireland and England and Wales and the Republic of Ireland that there are, the better. So actually, whether we're in or out of the Union, there's actually a benefit for everybody in terms of reducing these trade barriers. And I think the only way we can reduce them realistically is by Great Britain moving back closer into alignment on sanitary and phytosanitary checks, and in terms of the single market and such like. It's more to do with that than it is about threatening to unilaterally legislate and rip up the protocol, because all that happens if you trigger Article 16 is you reconvene the discussions you're already having in another forum, and you've still got exactly the same problems. And you also just invite an equal and opposite proportionate reaction. And at the time that we're talking about that we're living through a cost of living crisis, the very last thing we want to be doing is putting any more trade frictions in place, because that's exactly what will happen if the UK government starts tearing up the protocol that it signed in good faith.
Absolutely, Richard. That was some fantastic analysis. Thank you, covering a broad number of the aspects that are fundamental to the discussions that are going on, as you say, in Belfast, in Westminster, in Brussels, in Washington, and elsewhere. So I'm sure we'll return to this as well in the future. But having mentioned Washington, I'm going to switch now to New York, actually, because the Attorney General of New York State said today that Donald Trump and his children, Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump, have been ordered to testify under oath in her civil investigation of the former president's business affairs. In a tweet, Letitia James said, "A court has once again ruled in our favor and ordered Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump to appear before my office to testify under oath. Our investigation will continue undeterred because no one is above the law." Letitia James is a Democrat, and Trump has claimed her investigation of the Trump Organization for suspected tax offences is politically motivated. Uh, Letitia James is an African American, but Trump has claimed that she's a racist. Ex-President Trump did not immediately comment on James's latest tweet today. All three of the Trumps have fought subpoenas for testimony, part of a refusal to cooperate, which led to an accumulating fine for contempt. A New York state judge capped the sum at $110,000. Unusually, perhaps Trump paid it. The New York State investigation is one of a number of legal threats to Trump, but as a civil matter could only result in financial penalties. Other investigations, including into Trump's attempts to overturn election results in Georgia and regarding the deadly Capitol attack on January 6th, could result in criminal charges. So, Richard, a little bit of US legal history. Al Capone appeared before the federal grand jury in Chicago in March 29. As he left the courtroom, he was arrested for contempt of court. At the end of February in 31, he was found guilty in federal court on the contempt of court charges. And then in June 31, he pled guilty to tax evasion and prohibition charges and was sentenced to 11 years in jail. So my question is, if history teaches us anything, are civil proceedings by the federal government more likely to ensnare Trump and his clan rather than criminal proceedings?
I've really no idea, but to be honest, I think that if the only charges that should be brought against Donald Trump are those that are justified, and I think that there are clearly aspects of his behaviour that I think we've discussed on this programme before, round about the events on the Capitol Hill. I'm a little surprised that he appears to be. Has not been held adequately to account for that. But in terms of his financial dealings, I've long thought that his wealth was considerably exaggerated, most usually by himself. As a councillor, I had my ward, and in fact the Gordon constituency that I represent contains his golf course at Many, which caused such controversy, and while it's by all accounts an excellent course, the investment hasn't happened at the rate that you might have expected. There's plenty of good economic reasons for that in the area, but for somebody who had money falling out of his pockets, supposedly, it's you think he could have progressed some aspects of that a bit faster than he has. But to be perfectly honest, I think there have been journalists and investigators have suspected for a while that the Trump organisation and its various offshoots and subsidiaries, that their accounts maybe don't quite tell the whole story. Now, they've obviously been filed and accepted by the US authorities, but I think that it's a perfectly legitimate enterprise to go and make sure that the accounts that are filed are valid and are a true and accurate reflection of the business activities that they're there to describe. And if they are, then well and good, and if it turns out that they're not, then of course you would expect there to be consequences for that. So he shouldn't be persecuted by the law. I don't believe that he is, but nevertheless it's important that where there is a suspicion that things might not be all as they're presented, that the authorities are free to go and investigate that, and that they are not hindered by anyone, at least of all the Trump family themselves. There should be full disclosure within the law around that. I don't think the American people would expect nothing less.
Thanks, Richard. That's a good reflection. But for our final story, let's tie business and Scotland together, because legislation to support smaller businesses to raise finance, helping them maintain income and address rising business costs, has been published today. The Movable Transactions Scotland Bill will help give new opportunities to small and medium-sized enterprises and other businesses, allowing them to raise finance by securing funds against largely untapped assets like vehicles, planted machinery, or whisky. The bill proposes modernising and simplifying the law on borrowing against movable physical and intellectual property, and creating an easier way for businesses to sell unpaid invoices to banks and other financial institutions. The Public Finance Minister, Tom Arthur, said if businesses cannot fully take advantage of their assets to raise finance, they might otherwise have to resort to riskier and more expensive types of borrowing. Greater access to business finance will support innovation and productivity in line with our national strategy for economic transformation. So, Richard, you've mentioned productivity or the lack of productivity in the UK in comparative terms already this evening. And this appears to be a move by the Scottish Government to simplify and modernise what you and I were probably trained to call floating charges, securing debts over movable assets rather than fixed assets like building and land. And we know that the law in Scotland regarding floating charges was never very happily, and was developed mainly by the courts. So, is this a step forward to help support innovation and productivity that you would support? And are you aware of pressures or calls from businesses in Gordon, for example, who've been looking to simplify and modernise their ability to raise funds against the assets that they own?
No, I've not been particularly, but I mean, obviously, I've been aware of a general grumbling about how difficult it can be sometimes to access finance. So, I think that if this is a way that allows a greater range of assets to be used to secure loans and finance. That has to be a good thing, and it won't be something that necessarily every business is interested in. But for some businesses, this could make the difference between getting access to loan capital at a reasonable rate or not. And it's something that it makes it easy. If it makes it easier for that to come about, it also puts a bit more pressure on some of the other commercial lenders in terms of how they are going about financing that. So again, it's just a way of using assets in a more innovative way and allowing businesses to get access to the capital that they need to succeed. So I think that this is a very innovative, certainly in Scottish terms, it's a very innovative set of proposals. And if it allows us to do more with what we currently have, then that absolutely has to be a good thing, because one of the definitions of being more productive is doing more with what you already have. So if this frees up the ability to borrow based on what we already have, then I think that in and of itself is a very good thing. And I'm sure that businesses will be looking forward to seeing how the financial institutions react and how the financial instruments that they're able to access are amended in light of today's announcement.
Thank you, Richard. Now, we're tight for time, but there's one other remaining story that I'd like to squeeze in very quickly, if I may, at the end here, because the BBC has announced a raft of closures with CBBC and BBC4 to be online only. CBBC, BBC4, Radio 4 Extra and others will shut down and become online-only services, the corporation has said today, as part of plans to close television and radio channels in order to focus on streaming services. The BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, made an announcement on Thursday in response to the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorris's decision to freeze the licence fee at £159 for the next 2 years. He added that many of the World Service's foreign language services would go online only, while the existing UK-focused BBC News channel will merge with BBC World to form a single global rolling TV news service. Radio 4's long-range service, known as the traditional crackly home of Test Match Special, and perhaps more importantly for Scots, the Shipping Forecast, will lose its dedicated programming before being shut down altogether. There will also be cuts to local television and radio services in England, although the BBC insisted its overall budget for local journalism will be maintained. But Richard, thank you for bearing with me as we ran through that final story, because we're very tight for time, and that has to be our final item this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. If you would like to support us, then please subscribe or donate to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There is a £20,000 bill incoming for Broadcasting Scotland, and so the reliance on your financial support is greater than ever. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland and on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Meantime, Hugh will be here tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join Hugh then. And that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. Thank you. Thank you so much to Richard Thomson MP for his time and his contributions this evening. And of course, thank you to everyone who's been watching us this evening. Thanks, Richard.
Great pleasure as always. Thank you.
I hope that everyone can join us again soon here on Broadcasting Scotland. Bye-bye.